The afternoon sun over Dust Creek baked the earth until it cracked like old pottery. The wind that drifted down from the dry hills carried the smell of dust, horses, and whiskey. Wooden storefronts leaned in tired rows, their signs creaking under the weight of heat. Life here moved slow and mean, ruled not by law but by the men who carried guns and gold enough to buy silence. Clara worked the forge at the edge of town, her husband's old hammer striking metal with the same rhythm he once had. The sound rolled across the street like a heartbeat, steady, defiant, alive. Her apron was singed, and her arms were lean from labor, skin darkened by sun and soot. She had learned the trade out of necessity when her husband died of fever the previous winter. Since then, her days had been an unbroken loop of heat, iron, and stares she chose not to see. The men of Dust Creek didn't take kindly to a woman holding the hammer. They said the job was cursed for her kind, that a woman should cook, not forge. But Clara had stopped listening to men's words the day she buried her last one. She swung her hammer harder than any of them could. Each strike was her answer to a world that refused to let her stand. It was nearly sundown when the trouble came. The saloon doors banged open across the street, spilling laughter and the sour smell of whiskey. Luke Grady led them out, big shoulders, bull-necked, and drunk enough to forget fear. He worked for Hargrove, the cattle baron who owned half the valley. Behind him stumbled 3 ranch hands, red-eyed and eager for cruelty. "Evening, widow," Luke called, his voice thick with liquor and mockery. "You still pretending you're a man out here?" Clara didn't look up from the anvil. Sparks danced like fireflies as she folded steel beneath her hammer. "I pretend nothing. I work. That's all." The crowd near the saloon began to gather, sensing a show. Men with sunburned faces and women fanning themselves stood on porches, murmuring. The piano inside the saloon kept playing, but slower now, uncertain. Luke spat in the dirt. "Ain't right," he said. "Ain't right for a woman to be hammering metal when there's men hungry for work." Clara paused, lifted her gaze, just long enough to meet his eyes. Then maybe those men should work harder. A ripple went through the crowd, half amusement, half fear. Luke's grin twitched. He stepped closer, boots grinding in the dust. "You got a tongue on you, widow. Careful you don't bite it off." Her apprentice, a boy of 16 named Aaron, stepped out from behind the forge. His voice trembled, but he stood tall. "Leave her be, Mr. Grady. She's done nothing to you." Luke laughed, turning to the crowd. "Hear that? The boy thinks he's a knight in armor." He swung his hand and struck Aaron across the face, sending him sprawling. The laughter that followed was ugly and hollow. Clara's hammer froze mid-swing. Her knuckles whitened. "You hit him again, Luke Grady, and I'll—" "You'll what?" He took another step forward, close enough for her to smell the rot of whiskey on his breath. "You'll hammer me, widow." His men chuckled, one kicking over a bucket of water near the forge. Steam hissed, rising between them like smoke before a fire. Luke grabbed the edge of her apron and yanked it hard, pulling her forward until she stumbled. "Tell you what," he said, "why don't you prove you can work like a man?" He snatched the hammer from her hand and waved it toward the crowd. "Let's see if she can take a man's beating, too." "Luke, don't," one of his men muttered, but the words fell flat. Luke's pride had already been wounded. The town had gone silent except for the moan of wind through dry boards. Clara straightened her back. "Give me the hammer." He grinned. "Come take it." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air shimmered with heat, every face watching. Then Luke shoved her, hard enough to knock her against the anvil. The crowd gasped. When she pushed herself up, blood trickled from her lip. "Stop this!" Aaron shouted, rushing forward. Luke backhanded him again, harder this time, sending him into the dirt. Clara moved to help him, but one of the ranch hands grabbed her arm. She struggled free, landing a kick that caught the man's knee. He cursed and shoved her back. Luke's laughter turned to rage. He hit her once, then again. The first blow knocked her sideways, the second sent her to her knees. The crowd flinched, but didn't move. No one spoke. A few turned away. She fell against the anvil, her hand landing on the metal still glowing faintly red. The pain brought tears to her eyes, but she bit them back. The hammer lay in the dust between her and Luke. "Pick it up," she whispered, voice hoarse. "What's that?" "Pick it up," she said louder. "See if it answers you." He frowned, confused, but stooped to grab it. The handle was still hot. He cursed and dropped it, shaking his hand. A ripple of laughter escaped from the crowd despite themselves. Clara rose slowly, blood on her cheek, eyes burning with fury. "It won't answer, cowards," she said. Luke's face darkened. He struck her again, open-handed, sending her spinning into the dirt. Her apron tore, and the crowd gasped at the sight of her blouse, stained with blood and soot. She didn't cry out. She just looked up at him, jaw trembling with fury. The silence afterward was unbearable. Even the horses tied outside the saloon shifted uneasily. Luke stood over her, chest heaving, sweat cutting lines through the dust on his face. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "Ain't no place for a woman in a man's trade." No one moved to help her. The sheriff leaned against a post, chewing a toothpick, eyes fixed on the horizon. The preacher's wife covered her mouth, but said nothing. The piano inside the saloon stopped completely. Aaron crawled to Clara's side, whispering her name. She pushed his hand away gently and tried to stand, swaying on her feet. "Go inside," she murmured. "Lock the door." He shook his head. "Not without you." Luke sneered. "Listen to your mama, boy." Something in her eyes shifted then, like fire catching wind. She looked at him one last time and said softly, "You'll wish you'd left me to my work." He laughed and turned away, swaggering back toward the saloon as the crowd began to scatter. His men followed, tossing a final look of mock pity over their shoulders. One of them kicked the hammer across the ground. It rolled and came to rest beside the anvil. The crowd broke apart like sand scattering in wind. Doors closed, shutters fell. Dust Creek swallowed its guilt and went quiet again. Clara stood alone by the forge, her breath shaking, blood running down her neck. Aaron helped her sit on a crate. Her hands trembled as she picked up the hammer from the dirt. She stared at it for a long time, her reflection flickering in the steel. "Why didn't anyone stop them?" the boy whispered. She looked toward the saloon where laughter had started again, faint through the heat. "Because fear's the only thing that works harder than iron," she said. The sun dipped low behind the ridge, throwing the town into long shadows. Clara turned back to the anvil, lifted the hammer weakly, and brought it down once. The ring echoed across Dust Creek, cutting through the air like a vow. The sound hung there, sharp and pure, before fading into silence. Morning crept over Dust Creek like a guilty secret, soft and gray, unwilling to face the sins of the night before. The street was empty, the dust still marked by boot tracks and drops of dried blood. A stray dog nosed at the dirt near the forge before slinking away. Inside her cabin, Clara lay half awake, her body aching from every place Luke Grady's fists had found her. The room smelled of iron and smoke. Her left eye was swollen, her lips split, but her spirit burned with a cold, wordless fury. Outside, the town whispered. Folks said a rider had come through after midnight, a man too large for the horse he rode, a man who didn't speak. They said the ground shook under his mount's hooves, and that his shadow stretched across the saloon windows, like a storm rolling in. Some claimed he was a bounty hunter. Others said a ghost come to settle Dust Creek's debts. Clara stirred when the knocking began, slow, heavy measured, like the thud of an executioner's mallet. She rose with effort, wincing, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The knock came again, gentler this time. She unlatched the door. A man filled the frame, broad as the doorway, his beard dusted with road grit, his coat hanging heavy with trail dust. His eyes were the color of old steel, and his hands, though gloved, looked like they could bend iron. "Eli," she breathed. The word trembled out of her like a memory. He took off his hat. "You look like hell, Clara." She tried to smile but couldn't. "You took your time." He stepped inside, ducking beneath the doorframe. The cabin seemed to shrink around him. He set down his saddlebag with a dull thump and turned to face her. "I heard things. Out near Coyote Pass. Didn't believe him, till I saw the forge myself." Her jaw tightened. "It's fine. I'll manage." Manage. He moved closer, his voice low. They beat you in front of a crowd. You call that managing? Her silence was her answer. Eli looked around, the small table, the cracked window, the torn apron folded over a chair. Then his gaze landed on the corner, where her hammer lay on the floor. He bent down, picked it up, and turned it in his massive hand. The handle was worn smooth, the head nicked and blackened from years of work. "This one's too small," he said softly, almost to himself. "Too small for what needs doing." She looked at him sharply. "You're not doing anything foolish." "I've done foolish before. That's why you left." He paused, eyes meeting hers with the weight of unspoken years. "And that's why I came back." Outside, the forge sat cold and lifeless. He pushed open its doors and stepped inside, the smell of iron and soot wrapping around him like an old coat. His fingers traced the edge of the anvil, still stained with her blood. He stared at it a long time. Then he set the hammer down and rolled up his sleeves. The first strike came like thunder. The sound of steel on steel rolled through Dust Creek, startling horses, turning heads. Windows opened. A few men at the saloon porch lifted their hats to listen. The sound was different now, deeper, angrier, alive. By midday, smoke poured from the chimney again. Clara stood in the doorway, watching as Eli worked. Every swing of his hammer seemed to shake the air. Sparks flew like stars caught in a storm. Sweat darkened his shirt, streaked with soot. He moved with purpose, as if the metal itself understood the language of his fury. "What are you making?" she asked finally. He didn't look up. "A reminder. For them. For everyone." The rhythm filled the town. With each strike, more people gathered to listen. The blacksmith's hammer had always been part of Dust Creek's heartbeat, but this was something else, something that made men uneasy and women whisper prayers. Even Luke Grady heard it where he leaned in the saloon, half drunk, pretending not to care. "Let him swing all he wants," Luke muttered to his men. "He's just another loud fool with a hammer." But his laugh didn't carry far. That night, Clara sat outside the cabin, her bruises stiff and aching, listening to the forge blaze like it hadn't in months. Eli worked long after the stars came out. The glow of molten iron painted his face in orange light, his shadow enormous against the far wall. Finally, he quenched the metal in the water trough. Steam erupted, rising like ghostly smoke into the cold air. When it cleared, he held up what he'd made, a hammer larger than any she'd ever seen, the head square and brutal, the handle wrapped in leather cut from his own saddle. He tested its weight, swung it once, and the air itself seemed to flinch. "That's no tool," Clara said quietly. "That's a weapon." He set it down beside the anvil. "Depends who's holding it." The fire crackled. They stood in silence, the night filled only with the hiss of cooling metal. "Eli," she said softly, "I can't have you fighting my battles." He looked at her, the forge light flickering in his eyes, then learned to swing heavier. She crossed her arms. "You think hitting them back makes you strong? I've seen what revenge costs." He smiled, but it was a sad, knowing smile. "And I've seen what it costs not to take it." She turned away, angry because she couldn't argue. The world had taken enough from both of them, parents, home, peace. He'd left years ago after killing a man in a brawl gone wrong. Since then, his name had been spoken with both fear and reverence, like a storm that passed but left scars on the land. "Why come back now?" she asked. He stared at the fire. "Because you're all I've got left, and someone needed to remind this town what a heartbeat sounds like." The next morning, Dust Creek woke to a new rhythm. Eli was already at the forge, striking metal before sunrise. The air was thick with heat, and the anvil sang with every blow. People passed by slower now, pretending not to look, but listening all the same. Even the sheriff stopped outside, watching a moment before walking off. By noon, Clara joined him. She lifted the smaller hammer, testing its weight, and began shaping horseshoes beside him. The two worked in tandem, metal, fire, and silence weaving into something sacred. The townsfolk whispered about it, how the widow and her giant brother forged side by side like spirits of iron. At the saloon, Luke laughed at the gossip. "Let him make all the noise they want," he said. "Noise don't scare bullets." But when night fell and the forge's glow lit half the street, even his men fell quiet. There was something in that hammer's rhythm that made them restless. Later, Clara found Eli outside the forge, sitting on the steps, staring at the horizon. "They're talking," she said. "Good. About you." He shrugged. "Let him. A town that talks ain't a town that acts." She sat beside him. "You really think they'll ever change?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Men don't change. But fear teaches." The air cooled as night deepened. Coyotes howled somewhere beyond the ridge. The smell of rain hinted on the wind, though the sky stayed clear. Eli leaned his elbows on his knees, staring at his calloused hands. "You don't need to fear them anymore," he said. "They bleed the same as you. The only difference is, you stop forgetting what pain feels like." She looked at him, and for the first time in months, her eyes softened. "And you?" He smiled faintly. "I never forgot." When dawn came again, the town woke to the steady pounding of the new hammer, heavier, slower, each strike like judgment rolling across the valley. The days that followed turned Dust Creek into a place of whispers. Every porch, every saloon table, every church pew carried the same low hum, a story that grew taller with every retelling. They said the widow's brother wasn't just a blacksmith, but a man carved from the mountains themselves. That he'd fought in the frontier wars, where he once split a man's skull clean in two with a single swing. Some swore he'd wrestled a bear near the Bitterroot River. Others said he was half Apache, half something else entirely, something you didn't cross twice. No one knew the truth, and Eli Stone wasn't the kind to offer corrections. He worked with the calm of a storm before lightning. The forge blazed from dawn until night, sparks flying like fireflies around his massive frame. Clara worked beside him again, her bruises fading, her strength returning. She moved slower, more deliberate now, her hands finding rhythm beside her brother's. The people of Dust Creek began bringing their broken wagons and dull plows to the forge again, not because they weren't afraid, but because fear had turned into awe. Eli refused their coins. "Iron keeps towns alive," he said simply. "Ain't no charge for keeping something breathing." By the third day, the whole valley was talking. Out on his sprawling ranch, Mr. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, chewing a cigar and frowning through the smoke. He was a thick man with a thin heart, used to getting his way with silver and gun barrels. Luke Grady stood in front of his desk, hat in hand, avoiding his employer's stare. "I don't pay you to let stories grow, Luke," Hargrove said, his voice low but sharp. "You were supposed to make that widow a warning. Now she's a symbol." Luke's jaw worked. "He came out of nowhere, sir. Big bastard's got the town wrapped around his hammer. Folks see him as—" "As what?" Hargrove interrupted, leaning forward. "As a savior? This is cattle land, not scripture. You deal with it. Quietly." Luke hesitated. "And if he won't be dealt with?" "Then you make him disappear. Forge fire burns hot, don't it?" The order hung between them like smoke that wouldn't clear. That evening, the sun set red as spilled wine over Dust Creek. Eli and Clara worked in near silence, the rhythm between them steady, comforting. She watched him shape a length of steel into a plowshare, his hands precise despite their size. "You could have gone anywhere," she said softly. "Why come back to this broken place?" Eli smiled faintly. "Because broken things can still be fixed. And if they don't want fixing—" He glanced toward the street, where the saloon lanterns flickered. "Then you melt 'em down and start again." Clara laughed under her breath, though her eyes stayed worried. "You think the law will let you?" "Law?" He snorted. "Law's just a word men hide behind. Out here, there's only right and wrong, and who's willing to swing first." As night deepened, the town sank into uneasy quiet. The forge dimmed, its last coals glowing faint orange. Clara went inside, exhausted, while Eli stayed behind, wiping sweat from his neck. He stood alone for a long moment, feeling the heat fade beneath his skin. Then he heard it, the faint crunch of boots in the dirt outside. He didn't turn. "You boys took your time." The answer came as a whisper from the dark. "You talk too much, giant." 5 of Luke's men stepped out from behind the water trough, faces half hidden under hats, rifles glinting in the moonlight. The leader held a flask and grinned. "Mr. Hargrove sends his regards. Thought we'd help warm your forge again." Eli's eyes flicked to the barrel of kerosene one of them carried. "That's so." They spread out, slow and careful, like wolves circling a bear. One struck a match and held it near the kerosene. "Step aside, Blacksmith. We'll make it quick." Eli finally turned. The forge's glow caught his face, shadowing the hard lines of his jaw, the faint scar running through his beard. He didn't raise his voice. "You can walk away right now. Leave the fire, leave the forge, and forget my name." The man with the match smirked. "And if we don't?" Eli's hand closed around the new hammer resting on the anvil. The metal was still warm from the day's work, its handle dark with oil and ash. He lifted it easily, letting its weight settle into his palm. "Then the fire don't need wood tonight." For a second, no one moved. Then Luke's man laughed and tossed the match. It fell short, sputtering in the dirt. The next thing he saw was iron moving faster than thought. The first blow struck his rifle clean out of his hands. The second broke the post behind him. The air exploded with noise, steel, shouts, footsteps. Eli didn't fight like a man. He fought like something ancient, his hammer sweeping arcs that sang through the dark. Two men rushed him from behind. The hammer's head met one with a crack that silenced him forever. The other swung his rifle like a club, but Eli caught it mid-swing, ripped it free, and tossed it into the fire. Another lunged with a knife, slashing his arm. Eli barely flinched. He seized the man's wrist, twisted, and sent him sprawling into the coals. The scream that followed was drowned by the sound of the hammer striking again. It was over in seconds. Only one man remained, the youngest, shaking so hard his gun clattered from his hand. He crawled backward toward the street, staring up at the giant standing over him. Eli's chest heaved, breath white in the cold. His shirt was torn, blood from a shallow cut darkening the fabric. The hammer hung at his side, dripping something that wasn't his. "Tell Luke Grady," Eli said, his voice calm, almost quiet. "This forge don't burn for him. Tell him I don't bury men easy, but I will if I have to." The man nodded frantically, scrambling away into the night, his footsteps fading toward the ranch road. Eli watched him go, then turned back to the forge. The coals had gone red-hot again from the fight's fury. He set the hammer down gently, as though it were sacred, and poured water over the embers until steam swallowed the light. When Clara came running out moments later, barefoot and terrified, she found him sitting on the steps, hands resting on his knees, eyes lost in the dark horizon. "What happened?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He just looked at her and said softly, "You should sleep. It's over." But it wasn't over. By sunrise, every soul in Dust Creek knew what had happened. Word spread faster than fire across the plains. Some said Eli had killed all 5 men. Others said he'd beaten them so badly they'd never speak again. The truth was quieter, but no less fearsome, for men had been carried to Hargrove's ranch on stretchers, bones shattered, hands useless for anything but prayer. The 5th never returned at all. The sheriff rode by the forge that afternoon, tipping his hat, but not stopping. He had no stomach for another corpse, no orders from Hargrove worth dying over. People who once crossed the street to avoid Clara now stopped to offer bread, bandages, and quiet gratitude. When Eli stepped outside, men lowered their voices and moved aside. Inside the forge, Clara lit the coals and began her work, her arms steady again. She looked up once to see her brother sharpening the hammer's edge on a grindstone, not for battle, but to make it gleam. "I didn't kill them," he said finally. "I know," she answered. He nodded once. "But they'll never lift a gun again." Outside, a wind stirred the dust, carrying away the old sounds of laughter, cruelty, and cowardice. The wind carried the smell of rain that morning, though the sky stayed dry and cruel. Dust Creek stirred uneasily, shutters creaking, dogs whining, as riders appeared on the horizon, 6 of them, black silhouettes against the rising light. Their horses kicked up red dust that clung to their coats like blood. At their head rode Sheriff Cole, his badge glinting dull in the sun, his face a hard mask barely hiding fear. Behind him, the Hargrove men rode heavy with rifles, hats low, jaws tight. Word spread fast. By the time the riders reached the forge, half the town had gathered: shopkeepers, ranch hands, women with their aprons still dusted in flour. Clara stood in front of the forge door, hair tied back, soot still streaking her cheek. She had been mending horseshoes when she heard them coming. Her hands trembled, but she didn't step aside. Sheriff Cole dismounted, boots sinking in the dirt. "Clara," he said, voice low, weary. "Move away from the door." "What's your business?" "By order of Mr. Hargrove, your brother's under arrest. Assault and grievous injury." Her jaw set. "You call that justice?" The sheriff looked to the ground. "I call it survival." He motioned with his hand. The riders shifted, rifles leveling. The forge door creaked behind her. The sound alone was enough to make the men hesitate. Eli stepped out slowly, bare-armed and black with soot, hammer still in hand. The heat from the forge shimmered around him, making the air ripple like firelight. His shirt hung torn at the shoulder, revealing a chest carved by work and war. His eyes, dark as coal, found the sheriff first. "Morning, Cole," he said quietly. "You gonna tell me this is about justice?" Cole swallowed. "I'm just doing what I'm told." "That's the problem with this town," Eli said, stepping forward. "Too many men do what they're told, and not enough do what's right." Luke Grady pushed through the riders then, swaggering as if he owned the road. His lips still carried the scar from Eli's hammer weeks before. He grinned at Clara, teeth yellow under the morning light. "You again," he drawled. "Still hiding behind your monster of a brother? Or maybe you'd rather step aside and let real men finish this?" Clara didn't move. Her chin lifted a fraction. "You call yourself a man?" Luke smirked. "You want me to remind you what a man looks like?" The words hit the crowd like a slap. A few people turned away. Others stared at the ground. The shame in their silence was heavy, familiar. Eli's voice cut through it, low and cold. "You touched my blood once." Luke's grin faltered. Eli stepped down from the anvil where he'd been standing, the sound of his boots like thunder on the packed earth. He moved slow, deliberate, every motion radiating controlled fury. "Now," he said, raising the hammer, "I touch yours." The first blow didn't land on flesh, but on pride. Eli swung the hammer down beside Luke's boots, sending dust and grit into his eyes. The horses reared, the riders swore. Before anyone could raise a gun, Eli was on him. Luke fired first, but Eli's hand caught the rifle barrel, twisting it away. The shot went wide, tearing through the sheriff's hat. The crowd scattered but didn't run far. They'd waited too long to see justice wear a face. Eli drove a fist into Luke's jaw, the sound sharp as a cracking log. Luke stumbled, spat blood, and came at him again. The hammer flashed once, striking Luke's shoulder with a force that sent him spinning. The weapon clattered to the ground, half buried in dust. The riders moved to intervene, but Clara stepped in front of them, arms outstretched. "Put your guns down," she shouted. Her voice, raw and fierce, froze them where they stood. "You'll fire into your own town before you fire on him." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded to the men. The rifles lowered, but the fight didn't stop. Eli and Luke circled each other amid the crowd. The forge roared behind them, flames licking higher as if the fire itself wanted witness. Sweat and soot mixed down Eli's neck. Luke's eyes burned with hate and humiliation. He lunged, drawing a knife from his belt, but Eli caught his wrist mid-swing. Their arms locked, the knife trembling inches from Eli's ribs. "You don't win this way," Eli growled. Luke sneered, straining. "You think you scare me? I don't have to." Eli twisted hard. The bone snapped like a green twig. Luke screamed, collapsing to his knees. The knife hit the dirt. Eli's boot came down on it. He stared at Luke, chest heaving, then drove his fist once, clean across the man's face. Luke fell backward, blood soaking the ground beneath him. The crowd was silent except for the hiss of the forge. Someone whispered, "Lord have mercy." Eli stood over Luke, every muscle trembling. "This town let you beat a woman while they watched," he said, voice carrying over the hush. "Now they can watch you fall." Luke tried to speak, but Eli's next blow silenced him. "Not killing, just ending. When it was over, Luke lay motionless in the dirt, alive but broken. Sheriff Cole stepped forward, hand on his holster, eyes wide. "Eli, don't," Clara said. Her voice was steady now, stronger than he'd ever heard it. "It's done." The air hung thick with heat and judgment. Eli dropped the hammer, its head blackened from soot and blood. It landed beside the anvil with a dull clang that echoed through every heart standing there. He turned toward the riders. "Go tell Hargrove," he said. "Dust Creek don't belong to him anymore." They didn't argue. One by one, they mounted their horses and rode off, their silhouettes shrinking against the burning horizon. The sheriff stood a moment longer, then removed his badge, tossing it into the dirt. "I reckon the law can find its own way from here," he muttered, walking off into the crowd. As the last echo of hooves faded, the town seemed to breathe again. Women came forward first, then the men, their faces uncertain but changed. Clara wiped her face with the back of her arm, leaving a streak of soot. She turned to her brother. "You didn't have to do this for me." Eli's shoulders sagged. "I didn't do it for you," he said softly. "I did it for all of us." The forge behind them still burned, its flames reflected in the wet streaks of blood at their feet. Clara reached for the hammer, but Eli shook his head. "Not tonight. Let it rest." Together they walked inside as the crowd parted in silence. The forge's glow painted the street in red and gold, smoke curling upward, like a prayer that had waited too long to be spoken. No one forgot what they saw that day. The town that once bowed to cruelty now stood straighter, quieter, as though the heat of the forge had burned more than iron. It had burned the cowardice out of Dust Creek itself.